Then tonight we will start with a discussion of Muhammad. Muhammad, birth date is about 570, 571. He died in 632. His hometown was Mecca. He had kind of a sad life as a child. His father died, I think, as I understand it, he was a posthumous child. His father was dead, his mother died when he was 6. He was given in the care of his grandfather and uncle. His grandfather died, and uncle took care of him. Text says that his uncle was the head of his courage, or whatever, to quote one of the presidential candidates or whatever. I think that from the reading I've done, he was the head of one of the clans of that tribe rather than the head of the whole tribe. And one of the things that upset Muhammad growing up as a boy was the great amount of conflict among the tribes. And brother, so to speak. And this was a part of what upset him. Mecca was on the trade routes, but other than that, had nothing to recommend it. Hardly any water, no real agricultural base. Its main existence was as part of the trade routes, and so he saw caravans going in and out of town, and his uncle eventually took him on some missions. Apparently there was some poverty, although there's some dispute about how poor he was as a boy, whether he was really poor or whether he just sort of had to work hard and do his share of taking care of the geese and so on. That's somewhat disputed. But his uncle did take him on some trips, so he got to see some of the trade routes in some of the town and territory. And he was apparently a very bright young man. And was engaged in his early 20s as the steward for a rich widow named Khadija. And the book doesn't really tell you that he served first as her steward and then married her. But he had first been in charge of her affairs and for trading and this in itself shows you that women in those days could have an active life in business, which has not always been the case and was not territory since. But he apparently fell in love with her, or she with him, and I don't know that they 15 minutes. I don't know that we need to psychologize and say that this was an Oedipus thing, or it seems to indicate. They, at least among Islamic people, this marriage was very much respected, and there never been a hint of any disloyalty or unfaithfulness on the part of either Muhammad or Khadija during this 15-year period that they were married. As he matured, and it was though very unusual to marry someone who was older. And for a man to marry a woman who was older, I think, to be more specific. And there are some people who argue that maybe she was older than he, but not quite as old as 40, because she had half a dozen children with him. And his son was that or was not who they didn't have all our modern assistants in that regard, so we really don't know. But that's the way the story goes. She bore 4 daughters and several sons, all of whom died in infancy. Terrible, terrible tragedy, because to have a son, that is the way your heritage is carried on. To have no son is carried on. Only the one daughter survived Muhammad, although 4 of these daughters did live long enough to marry and have offspring. But only one, Fatima, with her surviving. So he did have some tough times, but he began to go out into the wilderness to pray, to seek some kind of inspiration, to think about the meaning of life. What is the religion to which we've been exposed? There was rather rampant polytheism in the area, and several goddesses who also were memorialized by statues or figures, and what was considered a high god called Allah that was recognized by the people. He didn't make up this name. Well, the name is the same as the name El, which is in our Bible, only with the definite article before it, the God. And they would refer them to the God as the God above gods. There were Jews in the area and occasionally some contact with Christians. Some people try to make a lot of his contact with Jews and Christians, although it's highly unlikely that those contacts would have attracted him to become a member of one of these faiths, because they didn't use Arabic, and so it would have been like giving in to a foreign power of some kind to adopt these other religions. But he knew something of it, at any rate, in this context. And there were Jews living in the area, at least Jews living in the town Yathrib, which later became known as Medina. And unless you're in Ohio. But so he had some contacts of that sort. He had probably heard the story of the origin of the Kaaba, which was a big rock-like box, small temple, in which was embedded black stone, which some Westerner snuck into one of these pilgrimages, claiming was maybe a meteorite. There were worships or veneration of stones. They're mentioned in the Bible. The placement of a stone as a memorial, and that is revered as a marker or a memorial. This is where Jacob wrestled with God, and this is where these various things happened. So it may or may not have been a meteorite, but there is a black stone embedded in this box. Have any of you seen any pictures of this whole area? I'll bring one next time. There have been a few taken, although unbelievers can visit most mosques, but not all. But they are not welcome to go to the holy shrines in Mecca. So these pictures have been sort of surreptitiously taken, somewhat more to exist. So there is this heritage that Abraham was down in this area, and specifically that Abraham may have helped build this small temple around which the large mosque area and worship area is now built as a huge courtyard around this smaller black building, black covered building. So that all that was there, and then there were statues of the gods put in within this black box temple, which I don't know the measurements of, but I sort of picture it as being maybe a little bit larger than this room, but there were statues in there of the gods and statues around of the gods. And then Allah had had some dealings with Abraham there. Now the story that the Arabs had picked up from what they had heard from the Jews was the story of Hagar, whom they regard as a wife of Abraham. And you know, polygamy was practiced in the Old Testament as well as in Islam in Muhammad's day. But they don't view Hagar as a concubine or simply a maidservant. They view her as a wife of Abraham. And you may remember the story in which Sarah, who had previously suggested this liaison, now doesn't want any more of Hagar and sends her out into the wilderness. And Abraham's a little nervous about this because this is, after all, his oldest son, and he's being sent out into the wilderness. But God reassures Abraham not to worry. This son's going to be the father of a great people too. And Hagar goes out into the desert with this child. And according to the legend, then she takes him out to a place near Mecca and puts the child down on the sand, and they run out of water. And she runs back and forth through a couple of hills, searching for water. And the child in the tantrum is kicking his feet into the ground, and the spring comes up. And that spring is still there. And that spring is the main source of water for Mecca, according to the story. So we'll sure have other sources nowadays. But so this is all some of the background and some of the legends, some of the things that were going on as Muhammad was beginning to think, going out into the wilderness to think, to pray, went to a cave to pray, and somehow had an experience very much like those that are recorded by prophets in the Old Testament, a sense of a call. I'm calling you to serve me. And I want you to take my message. The word that is given is recite or say. The Quran means recite. And he is told them to recite the message that is given. And at first he questions himself. And he goes back and he talks to Khadijah, and he says, no, something important is going on here. Keep with it, keep with it. And finally, he receives messages himself saying, no, you aren't nuts. This is really a message that you're being given. And some of this dialogue is in the Quran. And some of his uncertainty and then the reassurances that come to him about the message that is being given. So he starts to preach then to, first of all, his family, and convinces some of them, but not many. After several years, he had, I think, about 40 Christians who were convicted and committed to him. But there was more pressure on him. He was putting some pressure on the people in Mecca because he wanted to get rid of all these idols. And he wanted some of them to clean up their act in terms of justice to infanticide, get rid of sexual encounters outside marriage, things of that sort that they didn't like hearing about either. And so there was some pressure on him, and he eventually negotiated with some people from Yathrib, which eventually became Medina, and after a couple of years of back and forth discussions, he fled or left to Medina with his followers. That date of the Exodus from Mecca and going to Medina is the date from which they count time, which is Christians date time from the period of time. Yeah, well, it was sort of, they were running away, that's true. I don't know if they would have been wiped out if they stayed, but it was very uncomfortable, let's put it that way. They had been pushed into one corner of the city. It was a very unpleasant situation, and there was no future there. But the people in Medina, see my Ohio is coming out, the people in Medina wanted somebody to sort of take charge, because they were sort of sick of all the conflict going on among various strands of clans within their town. And so now this man who has been a businessman and a prophet becomes an administrator and sets up a period of religious rule in Medina. The Meccans didn't like it very much. Some of the Meccans came, and there were several battles. there's not time to go into all these battles, but it's sort of interesting. He builds trenches around Medina, and there's a war called the Battle of the Trench, and he wins that one. And they come back and they wound him, but they don't follow up on it. And he repairs himself, and he finally launches greatly undermanned, goes down and takes Mecca finally. And that was the end of the conflict. At that point, that went on several years later. He returned to Mecca, he cleansed the temple, got rid of all the statues there, announced the rules by which they would be governed, and kept some aspects of the old ways. And that was interesting. He kept that Kaaba because of its connection with Abraham. He kept the black stone, although some of his followers even really couldn't figure that one out. But I think this is just a stone. Why is this still here? And then he engaged in finally his farewell pilgrimage, in which he saved those elements of previous pilgrimages. See, pilgrims have been coming to see all these statues and so forth, and there were certain customs that had been developed in connection, and pilgrimages to the statues were a source of income. Some of you have been to the Holy Land and continue with that. Could be the case. Going to the Holy Land could be a source of income for somebody, and so it was for them. But he got rid of much of the anything that smacked of politics. We can talk about such in the black stone. So from thenceforth, then the pilgrimage would have only those details that he used or demonstrated in his last and farewell pilgrimage. Cookbook says he died with poison. I cannot find that anyplace else. I find several suggestions: malaria, some kind of lung trouble. Maybe that happened. Maybe this writer found a source that I didn't. That's certainly possible. But so he died. What did he leave? And, we've got after this. He died in 632, and I'm sure that after he died, there were periods of huge expansion of the followers, mostly Arabian, under the leadership of his colleagues initially, and then it spread beyond that. So that the area covered by Islam, by a couple hundred years later, stretched from Spain, would have gone all the way through Europe, except for that battle under Charles Martel that some of you have to learn in history a long time ago. That name sounds familiar. But anyhow, they stopped. They took Spain, took parts of southern Italy, the whole northern coast of Africa, across Asia, down into India eventually, and later into Indonesia, which is now the largest Islamic country in the world, but of course going across Persia. And there were conflicts involving the succession. And one of these little diagrams that I handed out shows you the four caliphs that were what they call here the Orthodox caliphs, or sometimes they're called the rightly guided caliphs, the first four, who were all colleagues of Muhammad in some way. And after Ali died, then you begin to see conflicts or a breakup between the two main groups, the Sunnis and the Shia. And the conflicts, at least initially, were almost entirely conflicts over the succession. Should the succession be somebody in the family of Muhammad? Or should it be somebody chosen by a consensus? And the Sunnis went with consensus, People should sit around and decide the leaders should sit around and decide who should be the next leader, overall leader. And the Shiites believe that it should be someone of the family of Muhammad, which meant at that time someone of the family of Ali at the time. It was a terrible battle in which Ali's two sons were killed and a baby grandson. It was just awful in the fight. So we will find, and I will spend a little time in talking about this. This is the branch they call the Shiites next time. So I won't spend any more time on that. The main group, the Sunnis, continued on its way, first having the center of gravity in Damascus, and then moving over the main center moved to Baghdad, and great culture in the Middle Ages, before Renaissance, before Enlightenment in Europe. Europe was still in what we call the Dark Ages, or maybe as dark as we come to have heard of them. These people had a great culture, great art, mathematics, science, developed an algebra, developed the concept of zero, did a number of things that had not been developed in other parts of the world, and very beautiful art, very great poetry. And so we tend to think of them as not being wicked in modern sense, but in those days, they preserved the works of Plato and Aristotle and the other Greek philosophers, so that when Europe came out of its funk, they were very grateful to find that the Muslims had preserved these works of philosophy, as well as advancing their own philosophy. So this is just a little sort of cultural background. Let's get back to the actual religion then. What was it that Muhammad taught? What was he trying to get people to do? When you read about this, what impressed you about the religion itself? If we can focus back rather than on the history, it's impossible to cover all the history. Anything that struck you for daily prayer? It's supposed to be. There's never any discussion about their Quran. It was supposed to be no word given by God, and there's no discussion whatsoever, like we have so much discussion of our Bible. Well, I don't think that's exactly true. No criticism of it, maybe. If that's what you mean. That's just what I had here. Drawing from this. Yeah.
Was Muhammad just a secretary taking dictation, or did he infuse some of his own thoughts into this, or was he just take it verbatim?
Well, in terms of the Quran, he would say that he was a secretary. Whether he did the writing or not, he memorized. This was in an age when people, for generations, passed down poetry, great poetry, way before Muhammad's time, was passed by word of mouth. So it's not unusual that even if he's mentioned as being illiterate, and they aren't sure whether that meant that he simply couldn't read well, or whether it meant strictly illiterate. But at any rate, someone else wrote the stuff down, but he received it. In that sense, he would argue that he was simply doing what God told him to do. God said, recite, and recite. And then it's passed on. In terms of the decisions that he had to make from day to day about how to deal with his growing community and how to build a sense of community, that would be a cooperative kind of thing with God helping him. He was doing it.
In our Bible, God put the words in somebody's mouth. Who was that? That was we studied that in Disciples, where God put the words in somebody's mouth.
Well, you could think of the call of Isaiah, for example, as being something of that sort. You know, Moses being told, goes back to one of the early prophets, and Moses saying, I can't talk. I'm not a public speaker.
That was it, Moses.
Muhammad had very much some of the same ideas.
There's a lot of similarity in some ways.
Well, the prophetic phenomenon, we talked one other time when you were talking about mysticism and law and that sort of thing, and I said there is a prophetic phenomenon too. We haven't, because we didn't deal with it in our discussion, brief discussion of Judaism, but you can see it here.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of approach to religion certainly coming out from Muhammad. So he described the responsibilities of those who would be his followers as having these 5 pillars, which are mentioned in this book. The first one is the creed. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. And you notice that Muhammad is a man, a human being. It's a monotheistic religion, very uncomfortable with Christian notions of Trinity or incarnation. God is not viewed as a father because they think that's an inappropriate way of speaking of God as generating a child. He saw lots of that sort of thing in the polytheistic religions of his community, and he didn't want anything human or God that was one in its purest sense. So, yeah.
He was a practical person, it seems to me, because when he went to Medina, he needed money. So he organized bands that would rob these tourists who were going into Mecca. And then he had to organize an army to take over Mecca. So he devised, he said in his plan that who died in battle for loyalty in the Muslim religion, he goes straight to heaven. And he described heaven as a real nice place, very lavish, and rosy cheeks, they take care of you and all your needs. So he proposed something that was rather attractive for these people.
Yeah, although the part about the caravan robbing is another thing that I think our little book likes to debunk. It's possible, I'm not so sure. Yeah, but it is the case that he was a practical man. He was able to build a community. He said, we deal in our faith with someone who did not live long enough to do this kind of thing and didn't face that kind of issues that the people who founded the Christian church had to deal with. And that's the way the people who attained power in nation states had to deal with how to conduct war against Christians and so on. And these folks had to deal with that, I think, a bit sooner. And had to, okay. I want to go through the 5 pillars first. The creed, with this emphasis on monotheism, and maybe this is a good point to talk about the notion of free will and predestination. If God is so all-powerful, God is creator, and God is in charge of everything that happens, is there free will or not? In general, Muhammad speaks of people having to make decisions, and also speaks of God as being in control of everything that happens. We have a similar problem. And some of our theologians have gone, Calvin, for example, who never denied free will, but still came out very strongly on the notion that everything that happened was determined by God. Never denied free will, couldn't bring them together. It's just about impossible. The fact that it's impossible means in some way that we're asking the wrong question, but we haven't we haven't worked out a real good answer to that one. One of the answers that's used, but not by all Islamic scholars, is the notion that when one is going the right way, one is going on the path that God has set for you, or God might let you go astray. Not choosing that you go astray, but permitting you to. I don't know that that's entirely satisfactory, but that's one approach that's used. The Quran, as you were mentioning in answer to Jim's question, is believed by some to be almost like an incarnation. Totally, and given in Arabic, you don't have to knuckle under to people who use some other language to such an extent that sometime after, in the early years after Muhammad's death, the early caliphs got together all of these different almost songs or songs that are put together in the Quran and tried to determine which ones were the most authentic that might have really come from Muhammad, that were what he would have wanted, made a copy, according to the story anyhow, made a copy of the Quran in Arabic, destroyed all the variant forms of it, and then never permitted it to be translated into any of the I can't deny it. I tried to erase it. The only thing that's wrong with this version, and a big impediment, which I didn't know when I bought it, is that the editor thought that it would be better to rearrange the chapters that are called surahs, are arranged in the correct Quran according to length. With the exception of the very first verse, the rest of them are the longest verse. The longest seems to be something about a cow. And that threw off the editor of this book, so the editor thought it would be nice to arrange them in sort of a subject and poetry kind of order. So the order is wrong, but the wording is as good as any translation. This is the verse that's at the very beginning of the Quran. Quran means recite. In the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful, praise be to Allah, Lord of the creation, the compassionate, the merciful, King of the last judgment. You alone we worship, and to you alone we pray for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those whom you have favored, not of those who have incurred your wrath, nor of those who have gone astray. And this, just a sentence or two from this one of the most famous surahs. Recite, in the name of your Lord, the Creator, who created man from clots of blood. Recite, your Lord is the most bounteous one, who by the pen has taught mankind things that they did not know. Indeed, man transgresses in thinking himself his own master, for to your Lord shall all things return. And one last one. In the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful, by the light of day and by the fall of night, your Lord has not forsaken you, nor does he abhor you. The life to come holds a richer prize for you than this present life. You shall be gratified with what your Lord will give you. Did he not find you an orphan and give you shelter? Did he not find you in error and guide you? Did he not find you poor and enrich you? Therefore, do not wrong the orphan, nor chide away the beggar, but proclaim the goodness of your Lord. Yeah. There is, by the way, the prayer, 5 times daily. The story, one of the stories is that when, there is a legend. This is in the Quran. I haven't found it yet, but it's in there. That Muhammad one night was contacted by the angel Gabriel who took him on a great journey. First of all, to the top of the mountain in Jerusalem, where some of you talked about. This is why it's so holy to Muslims. And from there into the seventh heavens. And Muhammad is carried from heaven to heaven to heaven until finally the angel even has to stay back. And Muhammad is received into an audience with Allah. And then Allah tells him that he should ask all of his followers to pray 50 times a day. And so on his way back, he encounters Moses. And Moses said, well, what did God tell you? And Muhammad says that the people should pray 50 times a day. And Moses said, take my word for it, that's not going to happen. go back and renegotiate. And so this goes on for several times where Muhammad goes back to Allah and comes back with a lesser number, 10, 25, and then 10, and then finally 5. And Muhammad says, you'll never make it, go back one more time. And Muhammad says, no way, I'm not going back there. One more time, I'm going to take what I got here. So he comes back with the 5 times a day. Now, all Muslims aren't in situations where they can practice this, but this is the rule, 5 times a day. Originally turned toward Jerusalem, but later when we were having a little strife or tension with the Jews, they changed the position of prayer toward Mecca. Now this is a powerful idea that all Muslims are turning together toward one place to pray 5 times a day. And the motions that are used in the prayer are all learned from the time when we're little enough. And they say that when you see the pilgrimage in tens of thousands of Muslims all praying without anybody commanding, kneel down now, stand up now, in absolute synchronization. It must be a very beautiful thing to see. And you will see them in mosques on Friday, in prayer on the street, sometimes where you would see this. Very well lined up and spaced between to allow for the prostrations and very, it's the kind of thing that molds a person, that shapes or forms a person. As Walter says, it's very powerfully put together, the responsibility. The third pillar is the alms, and this has been worked out to be 2.5% of one's total wealth each year. In Islamic countries, the government extracts this as a tax. In non-Islamic countries, it's sort of in between a religious duty and giving alms, but the figure is not the 10% of income or whatever that we have tended to think of as a tithe, but 2.5% of total assets each year. Then the fourth is the Ramadan feast, fasting forward, which is a 1-month fast. It celebrates the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad and celebrates his call and his visions. During that month, which is a lunar month, so sometimes it comes when days are long and hot and it's quite difficult. Yeah, right. That's a thought. I hadn't thought they always describe it as being in a place where it's very hot. No food, no water from morning until night, no sex from morning until night. Eating just enough to carry you through the day, but if you have to go out and work, it's tough. And children are excused, but I've heard that some of the children over in Lakewood actually do carry it out. I think our friend of this told about it. They have a terrible time in school. Yeah, hungry, yeah.
When it comes to testing time, you should
Yeah, it's tough. Well, that's one. And then the fifth pillar is the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that each adult is supposed to do if physically and financially possible, at least once during a lifetime. To go to Mecca in a particular month they can go to Mecca at other times and do part of the pilgrimage, but not the entire thing. 7 times march around this courtyard, but that she was afraid would die. And then on the 8th day, they make a larger trip, some 9 miles away, spend the night out of doors and spend the day in prayer and meditation outdoors in the desert. And then they run to another place about a third of the way back to Mecca, running as fast as they can. Muhammad did this on a camel, but I don't think nowadays there's such a press of people that I don't think they use camels and horses for this part of the pilgrimage. And then after sunrise, in several places they pick up 7 pebbles and throw them one at a time, calling out in the name of Allah, the Great, or the Merciful.
What is the significance of 7?
What is the 7 heaven?
It probably is, but 7 is such a number that it has, I don't know that I can find, but I'll see if I have one more book that I don't have. I'll see if I can find it.
7 days. Is right.
Yeah, that's true. And then there's a great feast where animals are killed and shared with those in need. And from what I've read, that part is really a bit out of hand, more animals are killed and they can make use of. The Saudis are now trying to get in get a good quantity of this meat frozen so that it can be used for people in need at other times, because much more is slaughtered than can be used. This is not a sacrifice, it's a feast.
It says in our book that on the 10th day they sacrifice.
Mhm.
Sheep or goat, they that isn't true.
Well, it's not, it's more for a feast. So, yeah, it's a sacrifice, I'm sure originally, that it probably carried over just like the sacrifices in the Jewish temple. And that was the killing of animals was part of religious observance in those days. But I think now it's mainly that you're killing these animals in order to have a feast and in order to simply carry out the things that the prophet did. So those are the pillars. The other thing that we need to deal with is Muhammad is gone. The Quran has some rules to follow, some of which are ambiguous, could be interpreted one way and then another. And new questions occur. If a Muslim has sinned, can he still be a Muslim? How do you deal with certain issues in changed circumstances? The kind of thing that the Jews had to deal with, that we talked about last time. And so they had worked out, first of all, a lot of stories of the prophet that were not in the Quran. And these were then committed to writing. And a number of different volumes or books were put together, some of which were considered more authoritative than others. Some of the folks that have been around and Muhammad really liked to talk, and they told a lot of stories, hundreds of them, and others didn't tell as many, but they put together some books, some of which some groups of Muslims like some better than others. These are known as the Sunnah. These tell the stories of the prophet, how he dealt with unusual situations, new situations. He was not primarily a lawyer, he was a religious and political reformer, but his companions consulted him and he came up with his ideas. For his companions, he was an ideal person, and they wanted to know what he was thinking, so they wrote down these ideas. So these traditions, called the Sunnah, are one of the main sources of Islamic law. The Quran is one, the traditions called the Sunnah are another. Another is what's called analogy. Is this situation like some other situation that might have developed? It's sort of like the way the Supreme Court does when it's dealing with cases. But does it fit in this situation, or how can you build on it by analogy? The fourth source is a consensus. Is there a consensus among the main scholars about how to handle this particular situation? So you have these four: the Quran, the traditions of the Sunnah, of the Prophet himself, analogical thinking, and public consensus. There's another one that's sometimes used, which is private opinion, individual opinion. What do you think? And mostly the Sunni Muslims don't use that, but some do. But mostly you find a little of that in the Shiites. But there's a reluctance to go that far, to impose one's own particular way on the understanding of what the law can be. Now, all of this that I said indicates, doesn't it, that Islam, at least in the main form that it's found, is very much a religion of practice of law. What does one do to be? You've got these five principles, those are the things you have to do. But then beyond that, what do you eat? What am I supposed to eat for it? How do you treat your woman? What are the rules for divorce? Things of that sort. All the way dealing with situations back in the year 632 or whatever, all the way through to how did one deal with things in Baghdad, how did one deal with things in Spain, up to the current situation, which is quite different. And so there are many varieties of ways of looking at the requirements of Islam. So while it's true that the Quran in its form is not subjected to scholarship in the way that we subject our Bible, and we'll tell you this is written by J and this is written by E. They don't do that. That's the point that the author is trying to make and referring to. And that other scholars who want to have communication with Islamic scholars are very exasperated. I guess that's not quite the word I meant by this, but you can't get beyond this document in order to ask. Well, some people have tried to figure out which of these verses were said when he was at Mecca, which were written when he was in Medina, which are earlier and later. Very little of that kind of scholarship is done by Islamic scholars, but there are great Islamic scholars, great philosophers, great philosophical systems. Just as we found in all the other religions that we've talked about, there is this aspect. And so, philosophy, and especially here, which you didn't find in the Eastern religions law, you find in Judaism, you find in Islam, some four main schools of law, the subdivisions beyond them. They agree, from everything I've read, on all the important things, and disagree vigorously on all the other things. In terms of what would be recommended. So that you can find, just as you can find good Jews who will eat pork, or they consider that they are faithful to the main message of Judaism. That's not the term, but they consider that they're being faithful to the message of their faith, who don't practice all of the laws that the dietary laws particularly. So you can find this in Islam too. The modernistic approach, the Turkish Ataturk approach, they tried to get rid of many of the customs that were really just customs of the people that were elevated to the level of religion. And of course, a lot of it happened to women. And women.
So they were smothered or something for everybody.
Well, only if it depends on which group you're in, and then you have to be with whatever your group is saying. There's not the feeling, I don't think, that you can pick and choose very well. Now that you might have in Reform Judaism, and maybe you could in a very modern urban setting, thing that's interesting is Muhammad was a city dweller. He was not a rural guy. He lived in Mecca. He lived in Medina. He was a city fellow. And yet, and yet it's in the cities that many of these restrictive customs on women have taken place. And out in the rural countryside, the women don't wear chadors and that kind of thing, and they're much more active in regular life. But there's nothing really in the Quran. Some of the Quran suggests that women dress modestly and don't go when they're whatever they giggle to Muslim men. And I mean, those things are suggested, but it never says that they have to be covered from head to toe.
You think some of those things are customs of the area and then
Yeah.
adapted to the religious practice, sort of like the ritual?
Sure. Just as the garbs that priests had worn what came from what people wore at a particular time, or academic garbs, or things of that sort. These things developed that way. The other thing is that there wasn't, in spite of the fact that he did permit for wives, if you could take care of them equally, you know, there was an absolute prohibition on sex outside of marriage. Fornication, adultery were prohibited. This was a big step. There was then a very strong sense of family and protection of the women from being molested in some way. And so some women support this garb rule, saying that they can go out and nobody bothers them. And they can even go out on the street and nobody bothers them. And they aren't subjected to the salacious views of anybody. I was talking to a woman the other day who was over in an Islamic country where she was, I guess, not extremely simply dressed. She was tight. But the cab driver really scolded her. And he said, my wife would never go out looking like that. And so, you know, there's that side to it too. Islam has always supported education, but not always education for women, or at least not in public. That's the main difference, and that's breaking down, and where this will go in terms of those. All Islamic countries don't keep them in showers and long garbs, and they don't all keep them at home. But in some places this is happening. Afghanistan is a little trouble right now trying to decide where to go.
Like the other mentioned that Muhammad had a harem that envied his friends. Muhammad.
Well, I don't think that's fair either. Muhammad was strictly loyal to Khadija as long as she lived. By then he was in his 50s, and he did marry a number of people then. He did marry a number of them. Most of them were political alliances, I think. There were a couple of younger ones. Yeah. Well, there's nothing. You see, this is a life-affirming religion that affirms sex within marriage. And there's no doubt about it that he had more wives than he permitted anybody else to have. But I don't think that he was viewed by anybody as being particularly macho popular kind of guy. I don't think that is the view that they had of him. More restrained.
Have just protected the women, like we look from, like in our Indian culture. They would marry somebody, a woman, and, just if they're related and widowed or something.
In many cases, you see, he's even telling you to marry an unattended woman in order to protect her. You know. Now, they have some of the same rules about divorce. They're more open to women in terms that a woman can seek a divorce, which Judaism did not permit. Judaism permitted only a man to seek the divorce. There is a similar kind of rule to the Jewish rule, though, that if a divorce is granted, the man can marry immediately, and the woman has to wait 3 months. I think you can figure out why. And so they both have miraculous and area where they were looking for that sort of thing, and they wanted to be able to prove the Trinity, if the power was not there. And some of the Islamic law, some of the Sharia, the word for Sharia, which is the word in Islamic law, means a path to a watering hole. What does that mean? The fact that this is the life-giving force of the culture, is the law. And while certainly probably not be a frustration hard, we can see what happens to a culture where these little threads break up and they're not just little threads that bind society all together. So, yeah, we had 8 or 10 wives, most of them older, a couple of them younger, one of them sort of questionable. You had to get a special revelation in support. For all he was doing for Allah and for all he did for those people, he probably earned it. I'm shocked at all.
I tell you.
I've always heard Allah. Which way is it?
I think it's wrong. But I could be, you could argue me out of it, but I agree, I grew up saying Allah too.
Well, it's probably like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. See, Walden would say Jabber.
Okay, folks, turn in your little sheets if I can fill out.
Big rose apartment and seen the.
There was nobody there to show us around, so I peeked in the window.
So,